Russia is bluffing strength to fool American patriots. The way Russia is perceived nowadays as a strong, mighty, and powerful empire has a big influence on people's thinking and people's actions in the West. If people think Russia is a megaforce, those people are more likely to pledge allegiance to Russia, to project their hopes onto the Russian Empire. Many in the West wish that the Russians would liberate us from our own elites. They have grandiose revenge fantasies of Russian troops landing on our shores and fighting the bad guys who scramble and scatter and shake in their boots. A lot depends on how Russia is perceived. Nobody in the West would consider working with the Russians if the Russians were perceived as weak. That's why Russian propaganda does its utmost to convey that image of super strength. But is Russia really that strong? And what amount of strength do they still owe to Western technology transfers and Western money? In the last years, Russian propaganda kept claiming that the East would unleash its secret superweapon, a new monetary global order. The ruble and the renminbi would rule supreme while the US dollar gets destroyed. The Eastern economy would flourish while the West collapses. Through endless repetition, many people in the West thought a financial collapse was a foregone conclusion. The fall of Western imperialism was a foregone conclusion as well. And it was also regarded that the rise of the East was a foregone conclusion. But then what happened? The Western elites simply and effortlessly drove down the oil price and implemented a few sanctions. They simply stopped lending Russia money. They stopped the flow of Russian goods to the West. And Russia started to bleed out. The supposed ultra-mega uber-power Russia was bleeding money everywhere. Its economic power now ranks somewhere behind Spain, and Spain is pretty weak. Russia can't make a profit if oil prices are below $100. Russian companies can't run if they don't borrow new billions all the time from the West or from their own government. It's embarrassing. Life expectancy in Russia is low, the medical system is in shambles, people are leaving Russia in droves, taking their money out. It's embarrassing. But the propaganda keeps on and on. No, Russia has no big problems. They just made a mega super deal with China, selling oil and gas to China. This is super awesome. The Western elites are shaking in their boots, crying for their mamas. In reality, this was pitiful. The Chinese aren't paying that much, and you gotta build these expensive pipelines again through rough terrain and so on. It's horrible. As for the Russian military, it was modernized through Western technology transfers. If you are a military superpower, you need to think in longer time spans. It's nice to have nuclear missile silos now, but they need to be maintained in order to work properly. That costs money. It's nice to have good, decent tanks, but as soon as your enemies or competitors have better tanks or better anti-tank weapons, it takes 10 years to have the new and expensive generation of battle tanks ready. The noted Russian opposition figure Garry Kasparov recently gave his analysis on the current state of Russia. He noted that Russia is falling apart right now and China wants to take a big chunk out of Russia's sparsely populated east. Chechnya might become a big caliphate. The rest of Russia might fall apart into different pieces ruled by different groups. The United States could completely collapse the Russian economy within weeks. Many Russian generals don't want to burn the bridges to the United States. So if Putin's reign comes to an end, he may throw a temper tantrum and threaten nuclear war. But what generals would follow his orders then? Now here is a map of a training facility. This facility can train 30,000 troops per year. And you also save money, because that training is so effective. You have laser systems on training tanks and all kinds of fancy stuff, computerized systems that evaluate the individual soldier and the command structure, the officer. So you can simulate all kinds of battles and you can get immediate feedback and very precise feedback. This is a great training facility. Originally, this facility was located in Germany, and the Russians approached the German company that developed this facility, Rheinmetall, And they asked, can we buy this thing? Can we buy a pretty close copy of this facility and build that in Molino? And this was in 2011. And so this German company said, yes, we would like to sell this to you. And the German government said, yes, this is awesome, you know, let's do it. Let's go with that. And so they started selling the pieces and started building this thing in Russia. One of the most modern training facilities in the world. Of course, 2014 came along, the Ukrainian crisis, and for some reason these empires, superpowers, got into this heated argument. Suddenly they were apparently not able anymore to divide the world among themselves and say, you rule this, we rule that, you know, that's all good. Suddenly they started to separate. You know, in a military sense, the cooperation stopped and the markets separated. And suddenly this training facility that was being built was an embarrassment to the German government, so they said, okay, let's stop it, stop doing this. But this facility was almost finished, was almost done. A lot of it was built in license. You know, they licensed different pieces of technology to the Russians and they were building it. So of course this was an embarrassment to the German government, and they said, well, we stopped it. But the Russians were saying, no, this is all going along as planned. This will be finished soon. We can train 30,000 soldiers per year how to invade other countries. Okay. Another example. When the invasion of Crimea happened, Russian forces, they moved really quickly. They had new fancy gear, new fancy radios. And a lot of American military people, top brass, pretty high up people, they were shocked. You know, the Russians have gotten so fast, they've gotten so good, how is this possible? So they started looking and they found out that the Russians just bought from the West, and, you know, this is how it went. And according to a story in the Daily Beast, American military officers were pissed. There was even suspicion that German special forces trained Russian special forces. But many other European countries were trying as hard as they could to sell stuff to Russia. Transport planes from the Czech Republic, armored vehicles from Italy. Thermal optic cameras that are being used on tanks from France. Renault, company Renault from France and Patria from Finland, they wanted to build wheeled tanks with the Russians together, joint venture. Now, Finland is one of the historical targets for the Russian expansionism and Russian imperialism. You know, the Soviets wanted to invade Finland, and the Soviets failed. It was a big, nasty war, the famous Winter War. Many people don't know about that, have never heard about it, never read about it. I suggest you read about it. And the Soviets even had a phony government ready to move in and replace the actual government there. But, you know, a few years ago, just very few years ago, Finland wanted to make tanks with the Russians for the Russians. In July 2014, the fix was in. European defense companies, defense contractors slowed down the deals, and they put on the brakes, and they stopped certain projects that were already underway, like these French super ships. A deal to the tune of billions of dollars. These were these kind of big carriers for Russian helicopters. It's $1.2 billion. And then you had the market of dual-use items. Items that you could use for civilian purposes or military purposes. There's this European military contractor company giant, EADS, very tied into Bilderberg and all these all these elite circles. And they produced, EOTS produced components for Russian spy satellites. An American company produced microchips for Russian military computers. French companies sold important parts and pieces for Russian bombers and sold target acquisition technology for Russian tanks and bombers. Isn't that interesting? Russian forces in 2008, when they moved into Georgia or breakaway republics, this is a whole different chapter. People usually heard only the Russian, in the alternative media, they only heard the Russian propaganda line. And there were a lot of photos of Russian snipers with Sako rifles, Finnish Sako rifles. They were sold to Russia as hunting rifles. So, what Russian in his private time is going to hunt with a super expensive precision sniper rifle? Half of the Russian nuclear arsenal depends on systems, systems made by companies in Ukraine, east of Ukraine, south of Ukraine. So the parts and pieces needed to move the rocket from point A to point B, these systems are made in Ukraine. Also, important parts, pieces, engines for the Russian troops or the Russian army are made in or were made in Ukraine. Helicopter parts, ship engines, on and on and on. This goes back to the Soviet days. A lot of the military production was outsourced to Ukraine, which at the time was a Soviet republic under Soviet tyranny. For some reason, the Russians thought that was a clever idea, but of course, if things changed in Ukraine, this would bring the whole Russian military into disarray, into chaos, That's one of the reasons why the Russians went into Ukraine. They knew a long time ago that the regime of Yanukovych was going to end. His days were numbered, so this wasn't a surprise. This wasn't a surprise coup d'etat by the CIA, and it wasn't as simple as that. This is way more complicated. And the biggest motivation for the Russians was the defense production there. And what happened was, when the Russians moved in and they had all these weekend warriors who were supposedly on vacation, these little green men, unmarked soldiers, they were securing production facilities for these helicopter engines and ship engines and so on. They were securing these facilities, and then they were dismantling the facilities and bringing the machines, bringing the stuff back to Russia. And there was always this threat from Kiev: if you, the Russians, invade us, if you try a complete invasion, we will retreat back and we will destroy any facility that you need, that you depend on. So you might gain a lot of new space here, but you're gonna lose all this production to the tune of thousands of billions. So, most people in the conspiracy culture have forgotten that Western elites had built the Soviet Union from the start. It was a backwards empire based on outdated concepts of serfdom and soldiers drafted from the farms. In the 19th century, the Crimean War happened, and it was much more than just a fight for the peninsula of Crimea. It was a massive war involving Russia, European empires, and the Muslim Caliphate. It took months for the average Russian soldier to reach the battlefront by foot or by hitchhiking. The Russian Tsars could not mobilize their force quicker because of the lack of proper roads, trains, and so on. Soldiers usually had to feed themselves somehow. Many died not from battle wounds, but from contaminated water, bad food, and subsequent diseases. Before World War I, the Tsars had a lot of problems maintaining their backwards empire. Other empires had moved on to more modern systems, but the Tsars made a deal with the French and the British governments. They all conspired against their new rival, the Germans. They banded together, mobilized their forces against Germany, and later claimed Germany had wanted this war. But the Russians had made a bad choice. They lost a tremendous amount of soldiers and money. They wanted out of this war. There was contemplation about a peace deal with the Germans and future cooperation. Now, the British, American, and French elites did not want that to happen, so they financed and guided the Bolsheviks, and they helped the Bolsheviks with a revolution and overthrow of the Tsars. Subsequently, Western elites supplied a lot of guns and ammunition and money to the Red Bolsheviks so they could expand their control, fight the civil war against the Tsarist white forces. Western governments fooled the white Tsarists. They pretended to support them, but they gave them too few guns and bullets. Even when the whites fled into exile to Europe, Western governments made sure the whites were never ever coming back to power. So the new Soviet system was established, but it was still very backwards and weak. A vast country of nothing. Trees, fields, huts. They needed electricity, power lines, factories, telegraph systems, cars, trains. Where would they get all this? They got it from Europe and the United States. To see all the details of this vast transfer of technology, you need to read the works of Anthony Sutton. This went on until the late 1980s. And in the last years, as I've explained, this continued. Western countries supplying the Russians, building their power. The United States government and NATO were feeding the red demon in the East and used that demon to fleece the taxpayer to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars per year, to expand the NSA, to expand the CIA operations, to globalize the world and centralize control.